In this video, we're going to take a look at how to configure PowerPivot for SharePoint. Now I'm going to start here on my domain controller, and I'm going to open Active Directory Users and Computers. I just want to show you a couple of accounts here. I have an account called Pivot App Pool, and we'll be using this as the application pool account when we create the PowerPivot service application. And I have an account called Pivot Unattended, and this will be our unattended data refresh account. Now I'm going to switch over to my application server. I'll open Central Administration, and let's check some prerequisites. I'm going to choose Manage Service Applications, and I want to make sure that I have Excel Services and Secure Store both already set up here. Now I'm going to click Excel Services very quickly and come down to Data Model Settings and make sure that I have a data model server set up. Now if you don't have Excel Services or Secure Store configured, or if you don't have a data model server set up, you'll want to go ahead and do that before you get started with the rest of the configuration. And there are links to how to configure those in the TechNet article that accompanies this video. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to register a managed account for our PowerPivot application pool. So I'm going to choose Security, Configure Managed Accounts, and you can see I have several here already. I'm going to click Register Managed Account, and the one that I want to use here is the one that we just looked at in Active Directory Users and Computers, and that account is Contoso Pivot App Pool. Type my password, and you can see there's an option here to enable automatic password change. So if you have password change policies, you can configure this to automatically update the password for this account. In my case, I'm going to leave this unselected because I have a non-expiring password. I'll scroll down and click OK. Now I also need to make sure that this account has access to the content database in SharePoint, and that's actually done through PowerShell. So I'm going to come down to Start, All Programs, Microsoft SharePoint 2013 Products. I'm going to right-click on SharePoint 2013 Management Shell and choose Run as Administrator. I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to use Get SP Web Application. And for identity, I'm going to use my main web application. Press Enter. And then I want to use Grant Access to Process Identity, and then type in Contoso Pivot App Pool, which is the account that we just registered in Central Administration. Press Enter. And this has granted my application pool account the necessary access to the SharePoint content database. Now, if in the future I add more content databases, I'll need to rerun this command to make sure that the account has the proper access. But for now I'm good, so I'm going to exit out of PowerShell. The next thing we need to do is to create a target application in Secure Store that can be used for the unattended data refresh account. So I'm going to choose Application Management, Manage Service Applications, and I'm going to click Secure Store. On the Secure Store Management page in the ribbon, I'm going to click New. Now for Target Application ID, there is a specific string that I want to use here, and that is PowerPivot Unattended Account. Now this is the default application ID that the PowerPivot setup wizard that we'll be running in a little while will use. So you can use something different here, but then you'll have to change it in the wizard as well in order for everything to work. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the default. The display name can be whatever I want it to be. I'll just call it PowerPivot Unattended Data Refresh Account. For contact email, I'll just use my Farm Administrator account. For target application type, I do want to keep the default of individual. Click Next. On this page, we set the type of credentials we'll be using, and we will be using Windows credentials, so I can keep the default here. Click Next again. For target application administrators, I want to include the user or group that will be allowed to administer this target application. So if you have a specific administrator who will be in charge of PowerPivot, you'll want to add their name here. In my case, I'm just going to use my Farm Administrator account. and click OK. Here's the target application, but at the moment there are no credentials associated with it. So the next thing that we'll want to do is to associate that PowerPivot unattended Active Directory account that we looked at a little while ago with this target application. So I'm going to select the checkbox for this target application and then click Set Credentials. Now for credential owner, you'll want to use, again, the application pool account, which in my case is Contoso Pivot App Pool, and then the Windows username and password is the unattended account. So in my case, that's Contoso Pivot Unattended. I'll type in confirm my password and choose OK. So the Secure Store target application for the unattended data refresh account is all set. I'm going to switch over to my computer running SQL Server. Now here in SQL Server there is one setting that we have to configure. The PowerPivot service application has a dashboard that will give you various information about data refresh and so forth. And in order for that dashboard to function, the application pool that runs Excel services needs to have access to the SharePoint admin content database. So we'll configure that now. I'm going to go ahead and open SQL Server Management Studio, connect to the database engine, expand security, expand logins, and you can see I have Contoso Excel App Pool listed here. That's the Excel Services Application Pool. I'm going to double click, go to User Mapping, select the SharePoint Admin Content Database, and I want to choose the SP Data Access role. Click OK. And now my Excel Services Application Pool will have access to that database and will be able to properly display the dashboard in the PowerPivot service application once we have that set up. Now we finished all the preliminary configurations. The next thing that we need to do is to install PowerPivot for SharePoint on our application servers. So I'm going to switch over to my application server, and I need to install PowerPivot for SharePoint 2013. Now I'm going to go ahead and open Internet Explorer. And I have bookmarked here the TechNet article that's associated with this video. And you'll see in the Before You Begin section, I have a link for the download for PowerPivot for SharePoint. So I'll click that, click Download. I want the MSI file, sppowerpivot.msi. Click Next, click Run. And I'll just follow the wizard through here. Accept the license agreement, click Next, Next again, and Install. Okay, the wizard's done, so I'll click Finish. Now I need to make sure that I install this on each server in my farm, and I actually have one more application server. So before I go any further, I want to switch over to the other application server and install PowerPivot for SharePoint there as well. So again, I'm going to open Internet Explorer, and I have the TechNet article bookmarked. Scroll down, go to the Download Center, click Download, choose the MSI, choose Run, follow the wizard through. And click Finish. I'll go ahead and close up my browser, and the next thing that I need to do is to configure PowerPivot, and I actually want to do that from the server that's running the central administration website, and that was my original application server. So I'll switch back to that server, go ahead and close out my browser here as well, and I'll close central administration for the moment. Now to run the PowerPivot for SharePoint configuration tool, I'm going to come down to Start, and you can see that it has shown up right here on my Start menu. So I'll click on it. And it's going to take a second to scan the system, and then basically leave me with one option, which is Configure or Repair PowerPivot for SharePoint. And this really boils down to configuring it because this is our first time through. I'll click OK. Now you can see here in the configuration tool that there's a whole long list of things that it wants to do to my farm. Now, if you're setting this up on a test machine and you're not really concerned about which accounts run which services, you could actually go ahead and click Run, and this would install PowerPivot for SharePoint very quickly for you. But in a production environment, we really recommend that you use a separate application pool account to run the PowerPivot service application. And that was the Active Directory account that we looked at the beginning of this video. So basically, we want to select Create PowerPivot Service Application, and then we want to uncheck the Include this action in the task list checkbox. And you'll notice that everything below that turns red. So basically what the tool is going to do if we click Run at this point is to do all of these actions and then stop right here. And then we'll go ahead and create the PowerPivot service application manually so that we can specify the managed account that we set up in Central Administration. So with this checkbox deselected, I'll go ahead and click Run. Click Yes to confirm, and it's going to do that initial list of actions. Now, this will take a few minutes, but I've sped it up here in the video so we don't have to wait. Okay, it's completed the first half of the configuration, so I'll click OK, and then I'm going to go ahead and exit the configuration tool. Now, we will ultimately want to run this tool on the other application server, but we don't want to use that quite yet. The next thing that we want to do is to go ahead and create that PowerPivot service application manually. So I'm going to go back to Start, and I'm going to open Central Administration again. I'm going to click Manage Service Applications. I'm going to click New and select SQL Server PowerPivot Service Application. It has a default name of PowerPivot Service Application 1. I'm actually going to take the 1 off of here because I don't expect needing more than 1. We'll go ahead and create a new application pool. I'll just call it PowerPivot App Pool. And I'm going to scroll down a bit, and then we need to pick the account that will be used to run that application pool. And of course, in this case, we want Contoso Pivot App Pool, which is the account that we registered as a managed account here in SharePoint Server at the beginning of this video. Now I'm going to keep the defaults for the rest of these settings. These are mostly database settings, but if you need to change any of these for your environment, that's fine. Click OK. It has successfully created the service application, so I'll click OK. And you can see it's actually not in my list here yet, so all I really need to do is refresh the browser and it'll show up. I'm going to go ahead and click on it because the next thing that we want to do is to configure the unattended data refresh account. Now here in the PowerPivot Management dashboard, you can see this sort of empty space here. This will eventually show you information about your workbooks once you have some workbooks set up. And if you see an error message in here, this is where you'll want to check to make sure that your Excel Services application pool account has access to that SharePoint admin content database. Now for the unattended data refresh account, I'm going to go ahead and click Configure Service Application Settings. I'm going to scroll down about a third of the way here. I want to type in the target application ID of the target application that we created in Secure Store for the unattended data refresh account. And that was PowerPivot Unattended Account. Scroll to the bottom and click OK. Now at this point, we actually need to go back to the PowerPivot for SharePoint configuration tool and run the remaining actions in that tool. So I'm going to go ahead and close out Central Administration here, go back down to Start, choose the PowerPivot for SharePoint 2013 configuration tool. Make sure that Configure or Repair PowerPivot for SharePoint is selected. Click OK. Now it's going to examine the system and it's going to take notice of all the things that have been previously configured, both from the first time we ran the tool and from the manual configurations that we just did. And you'll see it's going to come up with a much shorter list of actions to do here. And these are the remaining actions that we need to do in order to finish our configuration. Now I'm going to select Activate PowerPivot feature in a site collection. And you can see it gives me a drop-down list here of different site collections that I have. And I can choose the site collection where I want it to activate the PowerPivot site collection features. I'll choose my BI Center. Now I'm going to go ahead and start Internet Explorer here very quickly. And in my BI Center, choose Site Settings, scroll down, and then under Site Collection Administration, choose Site Collection Features. And if I scroll down in the list here, you'll see PowerPivot Feature Integration for Site Collections. And this is the feature that the tool is going to activate for me. So if in the future, after you've run the configuration tool, if you have additional site collections where you want to activate this feature, all you have to do is come into the Site Collection Administration settings and choose the Activate button here. Now I'll go ahead and let the tool do it for me in this case. And since I've made a change, these have turned blue, and basically it just wants me to go ahead and validate that this is legitimate here. Click OK. And I'm going to choose Run to let it finish the configuration. Click Yes to confirm. It's finished the configuration, so I'll click OK and click Exit. Now at this point, I want to go ahead and run the configuration tool on the other servers that are in my farm. And in my case, I just have one more application server, so I'm going to switch over to that server. Now, before I start the configuration tool, I'm actually going to open Central Administration very quickly here. And then under System Settings, I'm going to choose Manage Services on Server. And you can see by default, the server that we're looking at is Contoso-AppServe. That's the server that we were just on, and that's the one where my Central Administration website is running. And if I scroll down, you'll see SQL Server PowerPivot System Service. And this is started. One of the things that the configuration tool did for us on that other server was to install and start this service. Now I'm going to scroll back up, and I'm going to change servers to App Server 2, which is where we're currently logged in. If I scroll down in the list of services here, you can see that SQL Server PowerPivot System Service is not here. And one of the things that running the configuration tool on this server will do for us is it will install the service here. Now, you don't necessarily need to run the service on every server in your farm. In fact, you probably don't want to do that. But we do recommend that you go ahead and install it so that it's there. And if in the future you want to move your services around and change which servers are running which services, all you have to do is start it up. You don't have to worry about installing it at that point. So I'll close out of Central Administration, and I'll run the PowerPivot for SharePoint 2013 configuration tool. Click OK. And you can see one of the tasks listed here is register PowerPivot System Service on local server. And that's going to go ahead and add this service in to the services on server that we were just looking at. The other task listed here is activate PowerPivot features in a site collection. You can see the BI Center site is still actually listed here, but if I were to choose it, then when I click Validate, it will recognize that the site collection feature has already been activated there. Now, I have not activated the site collection feature on my root site, so if I choose that, then it will be activated when I run the tool. And it's up to you if you want to actually activate the site collection features on another site collection. You can actually unselect the checkbox here, and it will go ahead and handle the other actions and then skip this one. I'll go ahead and leave it checked and activate the site collection feature on my root site as well. I'll click Run. Click Yes to confirm. It's finished the configuration, so I'll click OK and click Exit. That's all I need to do on this application server. And again, we recommend that you run the tool on each server in your farm and go ahead and add that PowerPivot service on there so that you can turn it on and off as needed. Our PowerPivot for SharePoint Server 2013 configuration is now complete. Now let's do a brief test to make sure that everything's working properly. I'm going to switch over to my computer running SQL Server. Here in SQL Server Management Studio, I'm going to expand databases, and you can see I have a database called cities. If I expand the database and expand tables, I have a single table here called population. I'm going to right-click, choose Edit Top 200 Rows, and I have 9 rows in here, some cities listed with their populations, and a generic city called Anytown with a population of 200,000. And we'll go ahead and use this value to test data refresh and make sure it's working properly. Now, the other thing that I want to do here is expand security, expand logins, find my unattended data refresh account, which in my case is Contoso Pivot Unattended. Double-click, choose User Mapping, and then make sure that the cities database has DB Data Reader Access selected. And for any of your data sources, you want to make sure that your unattended data refresh account has read access to your data sources. So I'll cancel out of here, and I'll switch over to a client computer. I'll open Excel, choose a blank workbook. On the Data tab, from Other Sources, from SQL Server, my server is named Contoso SQL. Click Next. I want to choose that cities database and the population table. Click Next and click Finish. Now, because we're using PowerPivot, I want to choose Only Create Connection and add this data to the data model, because PowerPivot is going to require my data to be in a data model. Choose OK. On the PowerPivot tab, choose Manage Data Model, and you can see it's imported the data from SQL Server. I'll choose Pivot Table. I'll just use the existing worksheet. Click OK. And here's my population data. If I choose City and Population, I get a nice quick pivot table here showing my list of cities, the population of each, and the grand total of population. And I can use this pretty easily to test my data refresh capabilities. So on the File tab, I'm going to choose Save, SharePoint, Browse, and in my list here, I have my BI Center. Choose the Documents Library, and I'll just call this City Populations. Click Save. I'll close out Excel. Navigate to my BI Center. Go to Libraries. Go to my Documents Library. Here's my City Populations workbook. I'll click. Here's our pivot table of city populations. I'll go ahead and click back, and I'll switch over to my computer running SQL Server. Here's the population table. Now I'll go into Anytown here, and I'll change the population to 300,000. Switch back to my client computer. Now let's take a look at data refresh. I'm going to click the ellipses, and click the ellipsis again. You can see Manage PowerPivot Data Refresh. I'll choose that. And here's the data refresh page. Now there's a whole bunch of options here that you can take a look at and set up the way that you want them for your data. For our brief test here, I'll choose Enable. You can see there's a schedule here, but I'll also select Also Refresh as soon as possible. And that means as soon as I click OK, it's going to start the refresh. Scroll down, and you can see there's a number of credentials options here, and we've got topics on TechNet that go through how to use each of these. In this case, we want to use the data refresh account configured by the administrator. That's the option to choose if you want to use the unattended data refresh account. Scroll back up and click OK. Now I'm actually going to give it a minute here to go ahead and complete the refresh process, and then we'll take another quick look at our workbook and see if that population of any town has updated. I'll click the city populations link, and you can see any town now has a population of 300,000. So we know that the data refresh mechanism is working. It's using the unattended data refresh account credentials that we stored in Secure Store to access our cities database in SQL Server and update the data in our Excel workbook. I'll click back, and if I follow the ellipsis again to the Manage PowerPivot Data Refresh settings, you can see it now shows the refresh that we just did here, and I can expand and it will tell me what data connection it refreshed and how long it took to do that. Now, if you schedule the refresh to occur once a day, for example, it will actually keep a running list of those refreshes and the results right here. And then you can click Configure Schedule to get back into the data refresh settings page. I'll cancel out of here. And that's a look at configuring PowerPivot for SharePoint Server 2013. You can leave feedback on this video or any of our TechNet content by going to the TechNet topic and choosing the rating and feedback control at the bottom of the page. Or you can send feedback to docbi@microsoft.com.